The morning light crept over the flat horizon, spilling a pale gold across the open land. Margaret Hayes stepped out of her front door, the wooden boards of the porch groaning softly under her boots. The air was cool, still touched by the last whispers of night, and a faint mist clung to the ground like a tired blanket that didn't want to lift. She carried an old tin pail in her left hand, its handle polished smooth from years of use, and the faint rattle of feed inside it was enough to set the chickens squawking in anticipation. The coop sat a few yards from the house, a modest structure patched more than once with mismatched boards and bits of wire. Margaret swung open the latch, stepping inside as the birds crowded around her ankles, clucking and pecking at the dirt. She scattered the feed in wide arcs, listening to the rustle of feathers and the soft thuds of beaks hitting the ground. For a moment, she simply stood there, watching them move. White, brown, and speckled bodies shifting and bobbing under the early light. Their lives were simple, predictable. Feed, scratch, roost. In a way, they reminded her of herself. When the last of the grain was gone, she closed the coop and headed toward the small vegetable garden that sat behind the house. The plants were waking slowly, their leaves catching the first hints of sunlight. Rows of beans, lettuce, and carrots stood in neat lines, framed by a low fence meant to keep the rabbits out. She stooped to pull a stubborn weed, straightened, and brushed the dirt from her hands. It was quiet out here, the kind of quiet that filled every space, pressing in until even the faint buzz of an insect seemed loud. She had grown used to it, though she couldn't remember if she had ever truly liked it. Back in the house, the scent of fresh coffee filled the air. Margaret poured herself a cup from the dented enamel pot that sat on the stove, its sides darkened with years of use. She sat at the small table near the window, watching the sun climb higher. Steam curled from the mug, disappearing into the air as she took slow sips. The coffee was strong, almost bitter, but it warmed her hands and her chest. Across from her, the other chair at the table sat empty, just as it had for years. She didn't look at it for long. The barn loomed at the far edge of the property, its roof sagging slightly in the middle. Red paint faded to a tired pink under the relentless sun. It needed work more than she could manage alone, but it still held. Most days, she kept to small repairs. Today, she carried a hammer, nails, and a strip of wood under her arm, heading for the section of fence that had warped and split. The boards had been there since before she married. Time and weather had gnawed at them, leaving deep grooves and cracks that felt almost like wrinkles on a face. She worked slowly, pulling out bent nails, fitting the new board into place, and driving fresh nails in with steady, deliberate strikes. The sound rang out over the land, sharp and lonely. Sweat dampened the back of her neck by the time she finished. She leaned on the hammer for a moment, catching her breath, eyes drifting toward the horizon. A faint haze hung there, but the day seemed calm. A bird called somewhere in the distance, answered by another. Margaret turned and walked back toward the house, her boots leaving shallow prints in the dusty earth. Inside, the clock above the stove ticked steadily, marking the slow crawl of the morning. She heated a small pan of soup left over from the night before, eating it in silence. The only sounds were the scrape of the spoon against the bowl and the occasional creak of the house as it settled. On the porch, the rocking chair stood still, its paint peeling at the edges. She hadn't sat in it much since Robert passed. He used to take it every evening, a blanket over his knees in the cooler months, watching the light fade while she worked in the kitchen. Now it was just a shape in the corner of her eye, a reminder that the days had been different once. The memory of him was sharp today. She could still see the way his hands looked when he worked, broad, scarred, and sure. He had been mending a harness the day the accident happened, just before heading out to the north pasture. It was quick, everyone said. A fall, a blow to the head. No suffering. That was supposed to be a kindness, but it had felt like a theft to her. One moment she was making lunch, and the next she was standing in the barn doorway, staring at the stillness where he lay. She hadn't cried until later, when the neighbors had gone and the quiet had returned, wrapping around her like a shroud. After the funeral, people had stopped by for a while. They brought pies, casseroles, words of comfort. But weeks turned to months, and visits grew less frequent. Margaret stopped going to church, then to the market in town, except for when she had to. The world kept moving, and she stayed still. The house and land became her whole world, and it was enough. At least, that's what she told herself. On a shelf near the door sat a small stack of unopened envelopes. Invitations to community suppers, notices from the local women's group, holiday greetings. She didn't throw them away, but she didn't open them either. They were proof that someone remembered she existed, even if she didn't feel ready to step back into their world. The afternoon passed with small chores. She gathered eggs from the coop, sorted a basket of laundry, and swept the porch. By the time the sun began to tilt toward the west, the shadows stretched long across the yard. The wind shifted, bringing with it a faint scent of rain. Margaret paused, glancing toward the sky. Far off, clouds were forming, thin at first, then slowly thickening into shapes that curled and twisted. She stood there for a while, coffee cup in hand, watching them. The radio inside crackled to life with the evening forecast. A man's voice spoke in calm, measured tones about a front moving in from the west, bringing the possibility of thunderstorms by the weekend. "Conditions may become unstable," he said, as if reading from a script. "We'll keep you updated." Margaret listened without much thought. Storms were nothing new this time of year. Still, something in the air felt different, heavier, almost expectant. By dusk, the animals had grown restless. The chickens paced inside their coop, wings shifting. Even the old barn cat seemed uneasy, slinking around the edges of the yard with its tail low. Margaret noticed a hawk circling low above the pasture, its wings cutting through the dimming light. It wasn't hunting, just moving in wide, lazy loops, as if watching the land for signs of something. She stood at the fence, eyes following its path until it disappeared into the shadows of the trees. The quiet deepened as night settled. Margaret closed the shutters, locked the doors, and set the coffee pot for the morning. She moved through the room slowly, her hand brushing over familiar surfaces. The worn edge of the counter, the smooth back of a chair, the cool metal of the door latch. The land outside lay still under the darkening sky, but the air carried that faint, almost imperceptible charge. It was the kind of feeling you didn't notice unless you'd lived out here long enough, the kind that made you listen harder, even when you couldn't say why. She climbed into bed, the sheets cool against her skin, and lay staring at the ceiling. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, its voice rising and falling in the night. She pulled the quilt up to her chin and let the sound fade into the silence, her eyes drifting closed. The morning broke under a sky that felt wrong. The sun rose pale and flat, its light dimmed by a haze that wasn't quite cloud and wasn't quite clear. Margaret stepped onto the porch with her coffee, breathing in air that was thick and damp, the kind that clung to your skin before the day even began. The wind was light, shifting back and forth like it couldn't make up its mind. She finished her coffee quickly and set the mug down on the railing, eyes scanning the yard. The chickens were already scratching at the dirt, but they moved with a restless energy, pecking at nothing, glancing toward the sky as if they could sense something. The barn cat hadn't shown itself since yesterday evening. That alone made her uneasy. By mid-morning, the radio's voice broke through the hum of her chores. A storm system had developed faster than expected. Heavy winds, possible hail, and a heightened risk of tornado activity were now forecast for the late afternoon and evening. Margaret paused in the kitchen, the dish towel in her hand. Tornado watches weren't rare in late spring, but the tone in the announcer's voice was different. It wasn't just a possibility, it was a warning. She moved with more urgency after that. The feed buckets in the barn were sealed tight, the tools lined against the wall where they wouldn't become dangerous if the wind caught them. She latched the coop securely, checking each hinge twice. The old fence at the north edge had already been mended last week, but she walked it again, making sure no loose boards could become flying debris. By noon, the air had thickened into something she could almost feel pressing against her skin. Darker clouds began to gather in the west, their undersides tinged green, the kind of color that set a person's teeth on edge. She ate a quick lunch without appetite, listening to the wind pick up in short, sharp bursts. It carried with it the faint scent of rain, though none had fallen yet. She was in the barn, checking the latch on the side door when she heard it. The distant, uneven thudding of hooves. At first she thought her mind was playing tricks on her, the sound blending with the wind. But it came again, louder, more urgent. She stepped to the doorway, shading her eyes against the bright but shifting light. Out beyond the south pasture, 5 shapes broke over the ridge at a full gallop. Horses, not hers. She hadn't kept any since Robert died, but big, strong animals, each one moving with a desperate, erratic energy of flight. They were scattered at first, but as they reached the open field, they drew closer together, their manes streaming back, eyes wide and white-rimmed. Margaret's pulse quickened. She knew enough about horses to see they were terrified. Something had driven them, most likely the approaching storm, and they were running without direction. She looked past them to the west, and her stomach tightened. The sky there had deepened into a bruised purple, clouds twisting and folding over one another like churning water. The wind slammed into her then, a sudden hot gust that rattled the barn doors and sent grit into her eyes. She wiped it away quickly, glancing back to the oncoming herd. They were closer now, the sound of their hooves a steady drumbeat against the hard ground. She could see them clearly, a tall gray with a dark mane, a chestnut with a white blaze down its face, another chestnut smaller but wiry, a black mare with a scar on her flank, and a striking paint with mottled patches across its sides. All of them carried the same look, panic. She didn't stop to think about what she should do. She moved quickly toward the side gate, fingers fumbling at the latch in her haste. The wind tugged at her shirt, pulling her sideways, but she forced it open wide. She stood there, one hand gripping the post, the other raised as she called out over the roar. Her voice was nearly lost to the gusts, but she kept calling, a steady rhythm, low and coaxing. The horses slowed just enough to shift their path toward her yard. The gray led, the others following close, driven by the instinct to find shelter. Margaret backed toward the barn, still speaking to them, clapping her hands once to draw their focus. The paint shied at the movement but didn't break away. By the time they reached the gate, the wind had grown into a steady howl. The first drops of rain came in sideways, stinging her cheeks. The horses surged through, crowding together as they entered the yard. She didn't give them a chance to scatter. Turning immediately toward the barn, she moved fast, glancing over her shoulder to be sure they were following. Inside, the air was dim and smelled of hay and dust. The horses hesitated at the threshold, but another sharp gust outside pushed them forward. Their hooves thudded on the packed dirt floor, and their breath came in sharp bursts, steam rising in the cool interior. Margaret moved to close the barn doors, pushing them against the growing wind. It took all her weight to slide the latch into place. The sound outside shifted into a deeper, more ominous tone. The storm was closing in. Margaret turned back to the horses, speaking softly now, her voice low and steady. They shifted nervously, ears flicking, tails swishing. The gray pawed at the ground. The black mare turned in tight circles, but they stayed inside. She moved quickly around them, sliding the half doors of the empty stalls open so each could have some space. They crowded in, still jittery, but the solid walls seemed to calm them slightly. She set a bale of hay down between 2 stalls, cutting the twine and spreading it so they could feed. Few took more than a bite. Their eyes still darted toward the rattling doors. Another gust hit, and this time the barn groaned. Margaret felt the vibration under her feet. She glanced toward the small, high window near the loft. Through it, she could see the sky swirling, clouds moving in 2 directions at once. The hair at the back of her neck prickled. She checked each latch again, her hands moving on instinct. Every creak and rattle in the old barn seemed louder now, each one making her heart jump. The wind outside no longer came in bursts. It was constant, a freight train hum in the air. Somewhere far off, a faint siren began to wail, its rising and falling pitch carrying over the land. She stood still for a moment in the center of the barn, drawing a slow breath. The air inside felt close, heavy with the warm scent of animals and the sharper tang of fear. She could feel it in herself, too, a tight coil in her chest, the awareness that the next few minutes could bring anything. The rain came harder, drumming against the roof, finding its way in thin streams down the walls. A loose shutter on the loft window banged in the wind, each strike sharp as a gunshot. One of the chestnuts startled at the sound, jerking its head and snorting. Margaret moved toward it quickly, placing a firm hand against its neck, murmuring words she didn't think about. Her mind flicked briefly to the storm shelter by the house, a low concrete bunker dug into the earth. She could make it there if she ran now. But leaving meant the barn doors could blow open, and these horses could bolt into the open field where the storm would tear them apart. She stayed. Another siren joined the first, louder now. The wind's tone deepened, shifting into something more primal, more dangerous. Margaret knew that sound. She had heard it only once before, years ago, in a storm that had passed miles from here. It was the sound of the air itself twisting into violence. The horses felt it too. They pressed against the stall doors, muscles bunching under their hides, ears flat. The paint gave a short, sharp squeal, and the gray pawed the dirt so hard it struck sparks off a hidden rock. Margaret turned toward the main doors, her hands balling into fists. The sky outside had dropped lower, darker, and the world seemed to be holding its breath. The tornado was coming. The air in the barn was thick with heat and fear. The horses shifted constantly, their hooves drumming against the packed dirt, snorts sharp in the dimness. Margaret kept moving, checking each latch, each door, every place the wind might find its way inside. The storm's voice outside had changed, no longer just wind, but a low, rolling growl that made the wood under her hands vibrate. She went to the main doors again, pressing her palm against the center, where the planks rattled under the force of the gusts. It took her weight just to keep it steady. Rain hissed against the roof now, coming in sheets that pelted the siding so hard it sounded like gravel. Somewhere close, a metallic clang rang out. Something had come loose and was tumbling across the yard, carried by the wind. A deep, throbbing pulse in the air made her turn toward the small loft window. The sky, she could see through it, had gone almost black, churning in slow spirals, streaked with flashes of lightning. The flashes weren't the jagged, brilliant kind that lit up the whole world for an instant. They were muted, swallowed by the thickness of the clouds, like light struggling to escape. The horses felt it too. The gray tossed its head violently, stomping and backing against the stall gate. The black mare spun in tight circles, tail whipping, her breathing fast and shallow. Margaret moved toward them quickly, murmuring low, steady words as she pressed her hands against warm, trembling necks. The feel of their muscles under her palms was taut and alive, ready to spring at the slightest opening. A sudden, hard gust slammed into the barn, and the whole structure shuddered. Dust and chaff rained down from the rafters, drifting into her hair and sticking to the sweat on her face. She wiped her forehead with her sleeve, eyes darting to the door. She could feel it. One wrong burst, and the latch might give. Another metallic crash sounded outside, this one closer. The sirens from town still wailed in the distance, their pitch rising and falling, weaving into the moan of the wind until it was impossible to tell them apart. The rain thickened, slashing sideways against the barn. She could hear it hammering the ground outside, the splash and slap of water in the puddles forming near the doors. The air smelled of wet earth and something sharper, ozone, the electric tang that always came just before lightning struck close. Then she heard it, beneath the storm's roar, the faint, desperate sound of something else moving. Not the horses, not the wind. She crossed to the back of the barn and pushed open the smaller service door just enough to see. Through the curtain of rain, she spotted the far pasture fence swaying violently. Beyond it, the open field was a smear of mud and water, and in that mess of motion was a small calf, separated from its herd, its thin legs sliding and scrambling in the muck. It must have been driven here from a neighboring ranch, just like the horses. The sight of it tugged at her chest, but the moment she stepped forward, the wind caught the door and wrenched it from her hand, slamming it against the siding with a crack. The horses flinched and kicked at the noise, the gray rearing halfway before slamming back down. She lunged to shut the door again, leaning all her weight into it until the latch caught. The storm outside didn't care what she was doing. It pressed harder, howling like something alive. Her breathing came faster now, each inhale full of the warm, dusty air of the barn. She turned in a slow circle, taking in every creak and rattle, every restless shift of the animals. She needed to keep them calm. Panic would only make the situation worse, for them and for her. She reached into the corner where an old bucket of grain sat, scooping a handful and sprinkling it into the hay. The chestnut with the blaze dipped its head to eat, the motion seeming to settle the others for a moment. She kept talking to them, her voice a steady thread in the chaos. It was something she'd learned from Robert. Horses listen to the sound of you, not the words. But outside, the storm was shifting again. The wind that had been slamming against the west side of the barn now roared from the south, carrying with it a deeper, darker note. It was a sound that seemed to vibrate inside her bones, the unmistakable hum of air pulled into rotation. She knew what that meant. She stepped to the window, her fingers tightening on the frame. Far off, between the ragged curtains of rain, she caught the briefest glimpse of movement, a column of cloud, reaching down toward the ground, twisting slowly as it thickened. The base of it was lost in the dark, but the shape was there, unmistakable. The tornado was forming. Her heartbeat kicked hard in her chest, but she didn't move from the window until another flash of lightning lit the field and showed her the funnel lowering, its edges beginning to sharpen. She spun away, her boots loud against the barn floor as she moved to the main doors. She slid the heavy wooden bar into place across the latch, reinforcing it with the hay bales stacked nearby. The horses stirred uneasily at the sudden noise, but she kept moving, securing what she could. The funnel was still distant, but it would close the ground fast. Out here, with nothing to break its path, it could be on them in minutes. She knew she wouldn't have time to reach the storm shelter now without leaving the horses behind. And she couldn't do that. The wind found a new pitch, higher and sharper, carrying with it the ripping sound of something tearing loose. She looked toward the loft ladder, saw that the shutter she'd heard banging earlier had finally broken free, leaving the window open to the storm. Rain was already slanting in, soaking the hay stored near the opening. She climbed quickly, gripping the rungs until her knuckles ached. At the top, she fought to pull the makeshift shutter closed, just a wide plank on rusted hinges, but the wind shoved at it like a living thing. She braced her shoulder against the frame, forcing the wood into place and securing it with a bent nail that would have to do for now. From this height, she could see more through the gap in the boards. The tornado was clearer now, its funnel thicker, the rotation faster. It trailed a haze of debris already. Dust, branches, maybe worse, sucked up into its whirling core. It was moving diagonally toward her land. She descended, every creak of the ladder echoing in the barn's tense air. The horses sensed the change. They pressed closer to the stall gates, their muscles quivering under sleek, damp coats. Margaret stepped into the center of the barn, planting herself where she could see every stall. The air inside seemed to draw tighter, as if the storm outside was pulling the breath right out of the building. Somewhere close, the earth gave a deep, muffled thud. Whether it was a tree falling or something heavier, she didn't know. Her voice came without thinking now, a steady stream of words as she moved from horse to horse, touching each one, grounding them in her presence. The gray's breath was hot against her arm. The paint's ears flicked nervously. The black mare's eyes rolled white in the dim light. She stayed with them, even as the barn shivered again under the wind's force. Outside, the sound deepened to that freight train roar she'd heard only in memory until now. It was coming. And Margaret knew, with a sharp clarity that cut through every other thought, that this was the moment she would remember for the rest of her life. The barn was no longer just creaking. It was trembling. Every board, every nail, every joint seemed to strain against the force outside. The sound had become a living thing, deep, guttural, rolling through the air like a giant engine. It was a sound that made your chest tighten, that left no doubt about what was coming. Margaret stood in the center aisle, her boots planted on the dirt floor, feeling the vibration under her feet. The air was different now, thicker, heavier, with a faint metallic taste that coated her tongue. It felt wrong, unnatural, as if the world was holding its breath. The horses were frantic. The gray reared again, hooves striking the wooden gate with a crack that echoed through the barn. The paint sidestepped sharply, bumping into the chestnut in the next stall, setting off a chain reaction of movement. The black mare kicked at the back wall, her tail snapping from side to side. Margaret moved quickly between them, speaking in that low, even tone, her hands steady on their necks and shoulders, trying to anchor them in the chaos. Outside, the sirens had grown faint beneath the roar, swallowed by the storm's voice. The rain came harder, hammering the roof in uneven bursts as the wind shifted direction. The barn doors rattled under the force, the heavy crossbar bowing slightly with each gust. A crash sounded from outside, wood splintering, the sharp ring of metal against metal. Margaret didn't have to see it to know one of the outbuildings had given way. The wind carried the smell of torn earth and crushed vegetation into the barn, mixing with the sharp scent of horse sweat and hay. Lightning flashed through the loft window, turning the interior white for an instant, shadows leaping along the walls. The thunder that followed was immediate, a rolling boom that shook dust from the rafters. The horses jerked in unison at the sound, pressing toward the center of their stalls, their eyes wide and glassy in the dim light. Then came the shift, a sudden suffocating stillness that pressed on her ears. The roar dulled, the wind eased, and for a moment there was nothing but the sound of the horses, breathing, and the pounding of her own heart. Margaret knew what it meant. She had heard stories from neighbors who had been caught in it. The center. The eye. She moved toward the loft ladder, climbing just enough to look out through the narrow gap. The sky was a strange, swirling green-gray, brighter than it had been moments ago, as if the sun had broken through somewhere far above. And there it was, the funnel, wider now, its base dragging across the ground in a slow, deliberate path. She could see debris spiraling inside it, branches, sheets of metal, pieces of things too small to identify from this distance. It was massive, its movement strangely graceful, a predator pacing before the kill. The sight froze her for a heartbeat, but then the wind found its voice again, coming from the opposite direction now, faster, fiercer. She scrambled back down, boots hitting the dirt with a thud, and ran to the barn doors. The crossbar rattled hard against its brackets. She threw her weight against it just as a gust slammed into the structure, the noise deafening, the wood bowing inward. The air inside the barn was instantly alive with motion, hay whipping in spirals, dust stinging her eyes, the horses whinnying and kicking. She could hear the sharp hiss of something tearing free outside, followed by the hollow thud of it striking the ground. Another gust hit, harder than the last, and she felt the doors shift under her hands. She pushed back, legs braced, muscles burning. The gray screamed, a high, terrified sound, and the others answered, their voices blending into the storm's howl. She risked a glance toward the loft window. The light there flickered with movement, the shadows outside swirling faster now. The funnel was close, too close. The roof groaned as if it might lift away. She heard nails squealing against wood, the sharp, popping sound of something splitting under strain. The loft boards above her rattled violently, hay tumbling down in loose tufts that swirled around her boots. She moved away from the doors, knowing she couldn't hold them forever, and went straight to the horses. One by one she touched them, leaning her weight into their shoulders, murmuring over the roar. Her voice was rough now from shouting over the storm, but she kept it steady. The chestnut's breathing slowed slightly under her hand. The paint's trembling eased by a fraction. The wind's pitch climbed, higher, sharper, until it felt like it was cutting straight through the walls. The roar of the tornado was a constant now, no longer a distant threat, but a living presence pressing in on all sides. The floor seemed to hum under her boots, the vibration running up her legs. Then came the hit. Not the teasing gusts or the warning shakes, but the full force of it, The barn shuddered so violently she thought it might tear apart. The walls bowed inward. The roof panels clanged like loose coins in a tin. Something slammed into the outer wall with enough force to make the boards flex and splinter. The horses surged in panic, hooves striking wood, the air thick with the scent of fear. Margaret pressed herself against the black mare's flank, using her body to keep the animal from kicking out in terror. The mare's skin was hot and damp against her arm, her muscles quivering. She kept her head down, the roar so loud now that it wasn't just sound. It was in her bones, in her teeth, pressing against her chest from the inside. Debris rattled across the roof in a relentless clatter. Somewhere above, a board ripped free, letting in a slant of rain and wind that cut across the barn. She heard the crack of a tree snapping outside, followed by a deep, thudding crash. The crossbar on the barn doors groaned again, shifting slightly in its brackets. Margaret's stomach knotted, knowing if those doors gave way, the wind would take everything inside. She lunged toward them, shoving the hay bales tighter against the gap, forcing her shoulder against the center where the pressure was greatest. Her breath came in short bursts, her arms aching, the sound of the storm battering at her ears. The air felt thinner now, harder to pull into her lungs, and her eyes burned from the dust swirling inside. A sudden, deafening crack split the air, a beam in the loft snapping under strain. She glanced up just in time to see a section of the upper wall bow outward, the wood groaning like something alive. The gray screamed again, the sound so sharp it cut through everything else, and for a moment, Margaret thought the whole structure would go. And then, just as suddenly as it had built, the pressure shifted. The roar lessened, the walls eased, the vibration in the ground faded. The wind still raged, but it was different now. Broken, chaotic, without the focused violence of the funnel. Margaret stayed where she was for a moment, her hands gripping the crossbar, her forehead pressed to the rough wood. Her body shook, not from cold, but from the raw force of what had just passed. The horses were still restless, but their movement slowed, their breathing easing as the minutes stretched. She turned from the doors, moving to each stall, checking them with her hands, running her fingers along their necks, feeling the warm, solid weight of them, grounding herself in the fact that they were still here, still alive. The rain continued to fall in heavy sheets, drumming against the roof, but the deep, living roar of the tornado was gone. Margaret drew a long breath, tasting the wet air, and for the first time since the storm began, she let herself believe they might have made it through. The storm's rage had passed, but the barn still carried the scent of fear. The air was damp, heavy with the mingled smells of wet hay, sweat, and the faint sharp tang of torn wood. The horses stood restless in their stalls, ears flicking, sides heaving, the whites of their eyes still showing in the dim light. Margaret moved between them, her hands steady as she stroked warm necks, murmuring in the quiet that followed the roar. Outside, the rain had settled into a steady pour, no longer lashing sideways but falling straight, soaking the ground into thick mud. The wind came in softer bursts now, rattling the loosened boards in the barn's siding, but without the violence that had threatened to tear them away. Margaret lingered there in the aisle for a while, letting the sound of the rain sink into her. Her body ached, shoulders burning from holding the doors, arms sore from bracing against the horses, panic, but the ache was softened by the weight of relief. She had kept them safe. All of them. She opened the main door slowly, pushing against the resistance of the mud and the warped frame. The world outside was gray, the light dim and diffuse, the air thick with the scent of wet earth. Her yard was a mess, fence boards scattered like matchsticks, branches stripped from the trees and flung into tangled heaps, bits of metal half buried in the mud. She could see the flattened remains of the chicken coop, its roof peeled back like the lid of a tin can. She stepped out into the rain, her boots sinking with a squelch into the sodden ground. The air was cool now, carrying a faint, metallic sharpness from the storm. She walked slowly, taking in the damage, pausing to pick up a piece of wood here, a shard of twisted metal there, setting them into a pile near the barn. In the distance, she could see where the storm had carved its path, a wide swath across the prairie, grass pressed flat in one direction, trees stripped bare. It was a line of destruction that seemed almost deliberate, as if the wind had chosen exactly where to touch down and where to spare. The chickens had scattered, but a few were still alive, huddled under the warped remains of the coop. She crouched, coaxing them out one by one, carrying them to the barn where they could dry in the warmth. They clucked softly, unsettled but alive. She was checking the far fence when she heard it. Hoofbeats, steady and controlled, not the wild, panicked pounding from before. She straightened, wiping rain from her eyes, and saw a rider approaching from the south. The man sat tall in the saddle despite the rain, his coat dark with water, hat pulled low against the drizzle. Behind him the land rolled out in a patchwork of mud and standing water. When he reached the edge of her yard, he slowed, lifting a hand in greeting. His face was weathered, lined deeply around the eyes and mouth, his gray-streaked hair plastered to his forehead. "Afternoon, ma'am," he called over the sound of the rain. His voice was deep, steady, with a kind of calm that came from years of weathering storms. "Name's Thomas Miller. I believe you've got some of my horses." Margaret blinked, glancing toward the barn. The 5 animals she had sheltered stood there in her mind's eye. The gray, the paint, the black mare, both chestnuts. She nodded once. "They came in ahead of the wind," she said. "I couldn't leave them out there." He dismounted, boots splashing in the mud, and pushed his hat back enough to meet her eyes. "I'm grateful. My pasture fences are gone. Couldn't catch them once they broke." His gaze drifted toward the barn, then back to her. "Looks like you took the worst of it here." She gave a small shrug, though the weight of the damage pressed on her shoulders. "It could have been worse." They walked to the barn together, the sound of the rain filling the spaces between words. Inside, the horses lifted their heads, ears flicking toward the familiar man. Thomas moved among them with quiet confidence, running his hands over each one, checking for injuries. When he finished, he turned back to her. "They're in good shape," he said. "Better than I'd hoped, given what they ran through." His eyes softened a little. "You did right by them." Margaret felt something shift in her chest at that. Not just the words, but the way he said them, with genuine weight. She had been spoken to plenty since Robert died, but not like this. Not with the kind of respect that came from shared understanding. She made coffee while he secured leads to each halter, the steam curling between them as they stood in her small kitchen. The conversation was halting at first, practical about the storm and the damage, but it eased as the minutes passed. He told her about his ranch, the repairs he'd need to start before the next weather rolled in. She told him about the coop, the fence, the way the wind had pulled at the barn doors. When the coffee was gone, he stood, setting his cup gently on the counter. "I'll take them back now," he said. "But if you ever need anything, tools, a hand with repairs, you've only got to ask." She nodded, watching him lead the horses out into the rain. They followed him willingly, hooves muffled by the wet ground. She stood at the barn door until they disappeared over the ridge, the sound of their movement fading into the steady patter of rain. The yard felt emptier without them, but not in the same way it had before. Something lingered, an aftertaste of connection, as if the storm had left behind more than damage. In the days that followed, Margaret worked to put her land back in order. She mended the fence one board at a time, hauled the wreckage of the coop to the burn pile, cleared branches from the path to the pasture. The work was slow, her muscles sore by nightfall, but it was steady. Thomas came by 2 days later with a truck bed full of lumber and a coil of new wire for her fence. They worked side by side, speaking little but moving in rhythm. When the fence was secure again, he stayed for supper. Nothing fancy, just stew and bread. But the silence between them was easier than she'd expected. By the end of the month, his visits had become regular, sometimes for repairs, sometimes just for coffee on her porch. He brought eggs from his hens when hers were slow to lay, and she sent him home with jars of preserved vegetables from her cellar. It wasn't a sudden change, but one that settled in slowly, like the ground drying after a long rain. The days no longer felt quite so empty. The rocking chair on the porch was used again, sometimes by her, sometimes by him. The unopened letters on the shelf stayed unopened, but she thought maybe, one day, she might look through them. The storm had left its mark on the land, scars in the trees, gaps in the fence line, the memory of the wind's voice, but it had also brought the sound of another voice into her days. And in the quiet moments, when the air was still and the sky was clear, Margaret found herself listening for the distant rhythm of hoofbeats, knowing that the next time they came, she wouldn't be alone in hearing them. Even the fiercest storms can bring more than destruction. They can open doors we thought were closed forever and lead us to the unexpected company we didn't know we were waiting for. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of love, resilience, and second chances in the untamed heart of the frontier, make sure to subscribe to Wild West Love Chronicles so you won't miss the next adventure waiting just beyond the horizon.